The mud at Harrow Creek had frozen overnight, and Leora had been standing in it long enough that she no longer felt the cold working through the soles of her boots. She held the letter from Foss, refolded it with slow, careful hands, and tried to arrange her face into something that did not betray the full scale of what was happening to her. He had dismissed her on the steps of his trading post. Not inside, where it might have been private, on the steps, in front of 3 trappers sharing a tin of tobacco, 2 women from the settlement who had stopped to watch, and a boy of about 12 who stared at her with the frank cruelty of children who have not yet learned to disguise it. She had traveled 11 days to get here, 11 days by rail from Guelph to Kamloops, then 2 more by supply wagon into the Chilcotin, because a man named Foss had written to her employer's widow that he needed a capable woman to manage his post's accounts and keep the household. The widow had passed the letter to Leora, who had been quietly desperate for something that resembled a future. She was 27 years old. In the mathematics of this particular corner of British Columbia, in the autumn of 1891, that made her a woman who had waited too long and missed too much, a schoolteacher who had spent 4 years managing her mother's illness and her father's debt, and who had arrived at the far side of both, with nothing to show for it but steady hands and an ability to make a ledger balance in the dark. Foss was a thick man with a satisfied face. He had read her letter of introduction, looked at her for a long moment, and then informed her, with the easy contempt of a man who has never needed anything from anyone, that she was not what he'd expected, that the arrangement had been made in error, that she could collect herself and find passage back to wherever she'd come from, as the post had no charity to spare. There was a particular way the women by the door murmured to each other, a soft, pointed sound, like a blade being run along a whetstone. Leora had heard that sound before, in the parlors of Guelph when her family lost the house, and once in a church vestibule after her mother's funeral, and she had thought, wrongly, that she had grown used to it. She looked down at her trunk. She had $3.40. A return ticket to Kamloops would cost $4. There was no family to wire. There was no family left to wire. Her mother's sister in Halifax had not written back in 2 years. The wind came down off the plateau and found the gap between her collar and her hair. And something in her chest simply gave way, the way ice gives way, when the pressure finally exceeds what it can hold. She sat down on her trunk on the frozen steps of the trading post and put her face into her gloved hands. Nobody wants me. The words formed without her permission, welling up from somewhere below, thought. Some marrow-deep place that had been keeping a silent count of all the times she had been passed over and looked through and quietly returned. Like a garment purchased in error. It was not a plea. It was an accounting, and it balanced with terrible precision. She did not hear the boots until they stopped directly in front of her. She looked up. The man standing over her was difficult to categorize. He was very large, in the way of someone who has spent a long time working in conditions that do not permit softness. His coat was oiled canvas and heavy wool, worn to a perfect dull utility. A dark beard shot through at the jaw with early grey, eyes the color of lake ice in October, that particular blue-grey that carries no warmth but still, somehow, holds light. He was looking at her with an expression that was not pity. It was something more unsettling than pity. A kind of flat, accurate appraisal, as though he had seen exactly what was happening and had arrived at a conclusion. He turned his head toward Foss, who had remained on the post, steps watching, with the complacent satisfaction of a man enjoying the aftermath of his own decision. "She's with me." His voice was low. It didn't carry in the way of a man who shouts. It carried the way a river carries things without apparent effort, simply because the current is strong enough. Foss blinked. "Now, Haddon, you dismissed her." The man did not look at Leora. He was still looking at Foss. She's released from your arrangement. That makes her free to enter another. A silence settled over the yard that had a weight to it. Leora understood she was being claimed like an unclaimed parcel, like cargo left at the wrong station. Some piece of her, the piece that had survived 4 years of hard things, considered that she should object. She filed the objection away for later. Later, when she was not sitting on a frozen trunk with $3.40 and nowhere to sleep. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, when the watching faces had begun to drift away. Haddon looked down at her then. "I know," he said. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Then get up." She got up. He didn't explain himself during the 2 hours it took to load his wagon and leave Harrow Creek. He didn't explain himself on the first day of travel, or the second. He answered her questions with the minimum number of words required for accuracy. The property was 4 hours further into the mountains. He ran a timber operation. He had 30-odd men. The previous man who'd managed the accounts had left in the fall, without notice or completed ledgers. That was all. He did not ask where she'd come from, or why she had accepted a post in the Chilcotin. He built fires at camp with an economy of motion that Leora found obscurely comforting. He did not require her to perform gratitude. When the trail climbed steeply on the 3rd morning and the temperature dropped enough that her breath came in visible puffs, he stopped the wagon without comment, reached under the bench, and produced a heavy wool blanket smelling of cedar and wood smoke. He set it on the bench beside her and clicked the horses forward again. He had not offered it. He had simply made it available. She wrapped it around her shoulders and did not thank him, because something in the gesture indicated that thanks were not the point. The property revealed itself at the crest of a long ridge. A valley pressed between 2 peaks, a creek running through its center, the camp built along the northern bank. The sawmill was running when they arrived, its circular saw throwing a high whine into the cold air. Men came out of the bunkhouses to unload the supplies, and their eyes found Leora immediately. That collective assessment, the particular weight of it, which she was already familiar with. Haddon stood up on the wagon board. He did not raise his voice. "This is Leora," he said. "She manages the books and the orders. She has my authority on both. Anyone who makes her work harder than it needs to be can draw their pay and walk." He sat back down. Nobody spoke. The foreman simply nodded and sent the men back to the mill. The cabin was a mess. 2 stories of squared log chinked with moss and clay, a wide porch overlooking the valley, and an interior that had been organized once, long ago, and had been declining steadily ever since. The plank table was entirely buried under paper, supply receipts, delivery tallies, penciled notes, and at least 3 ledgers with their spines cracked from being left open face down. A cold iron stove, shelves in no particular order, a fine layer of ash over every flat surface. Leora stood in the doorway, took stock of it, and set down her bag. "Where's the water barrel?" she said. He pointed. She rolled up her sleeves. In 3 weeks she reduced the chaos to order. Not tidiness, she was practical enough to know. A working cabin in the mountains wasn't a parlor, but a functional order, where things could be found, and the stove drew properly, and the table had a clear surface large enough to work on. The accounts were worse than the physical disorder. On the 4th night, working by kerosene lamp, while Haddon sat by the stove reading a month-old Victoria colonist, Leora found the bleed. She set down her pencil and looked at the column again, then cross-referenced it against the delivery tallies. "Haddon," she said. He turned a page. Your accounts are being stripped." The newspaper did not move, but he went very still in the way of a large animal that has heard something requiring its full attention. She carried the open ledger to him and set it on the arm of his chair. She pointed to the column without touching it. "Your former man, Price, was ordering supplies for 34 men and billing you for 34. You have 31 on the payroll. The difference, 3 men's rations every month for 8 months, was going out the south access road on a second wagon. I found the wheel tallies in the old delivery log. Haddon looked at the figures for a long time. "You're certain?" he said, not a question. "Numbers don't make mistakes," Leora said. "People do." Price made this one deliberately. Haddon stood up. He was very tall in the low-ceilinged room. He took his coat from the peg and looked at her with those lake-grey eyes and said, with perfect quiet, "Lock up." He went out into the dark. She locked up. She sat by the stove for a long time, listening to the wind in the pines and then to a raised voice somewhere below in the valley, brief and abruptly silenced. In the morning, the south bunkhouse had a vacancy. Haddon sat down to breakfast and said, without preamble, "You sign the supply orders now. Nothing moves without your mark." He looked at his plate. "You saved this operation a good deal of money," he said. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a movement, a slight deepening at the corner of his mouth. But she noticed it, and the noticing did something unexpected to the space below her ribs. February came in hard. An ice storm sealed the valley for 9 days, and during those 9 days they were alone in the cabin, the men sheltered in the bunkhouses, the mill quiet. They fell into a rhythm she could not have named. She worked at the table, he worked at the bench by the window, mending harness or sharpening tools, and the silence between them was not empty. It had a texture to it, a density she was not sure she trusted herself to interpret correctly. On the 7th evening, she was sewing by the fire, and he was across the room. And she looked up at a particular angle and found him looking at her. Not with calculation, with something she recognized as longing, because she had felt it herself often enough to know its shape. The recognition of it hit her somewhere unexpectedly tender. She looked back down at her work and did not look up again for a long time. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. Eventually, he went to bed. She sat by the fire for another hour, after the light went out under his door, and thought about the spring thaw, 12 weeks away, and the arrangement they had, which was clear and businesslike and finite. She thought about the $700 she had accumulated since October, which was enough to start something real. She thought about these things with great concentration, because the alternative was to think about the 9 days. She had watched him through the window, bracing into a blizzard, to bring extra wood to the men, without being asked. The territorial land agent arrived in late March, when the mud was back and the trail was open. He came with a constable from the settlement, and a man Leora recognized immediately, Foss, in a clean coat, with a satisfied expression she understood at once. "The land grant," the agent explained, setting papers on her clean table. The grant under which Haddon held his timber license required the holder to maintain what was termed suitable moral character and lawful domestic arrangement. The presence of a woman on the property who was not a wife, not a relation, and who had previously been associated with a commercial establishment. Leora understood exactly what Foss had done. He had found the pressure point and applied it with bureaucratic precision. Haddon came in from the mill, still carrying a length of chain over one shoulder. He looked at the agent, then at Foss, then at the papers on her table, with the same flat patience he applied to everything. He set the chain down. He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas shirt and took out a folded document and placed it in Leora's hands. She unfolded it. It was a marriage record issued by the provincial registrar's office, dated January 14th, 8 weeks ago. Her name, his name, a proxy stamp and a registrar's seal. She stared at it. The room was very quiet. "That is my wife," Haddon said, "and the person who holds signing authority over this operation's accounts, which makes her a named partner in the license. I would suggest you read the relevant section again before making any further claims. Foss's face went red, then pale. The agent looked at the document for a long moment. He collected his papers. When the door closed behind both of them, Leora was still holding the record in both hands, and the blood had left her fingers. She looked up. "When did you do this?" she said. Her voice was entirely level. "January," he said. "When Price left for Harrow Creek, I knew he would sell what he knew to the highest bidder. Foss was the obvious buyer. You registered us as married without my knowledge. It is legal. I am aware that it is legal." Something in her voice sharpened, and she did not try to control it. "I am also aware that I am not a timber parcel or a supply contract to be registered without consultation. You gave me an arrangement, Haddon. You put money in this ledger every month so I would know I had a choice, and then you made the most significant decision of my life, without asking whether I wanted it made." He was very still. "You're right," he said. The simplicity of it stopped her. She had expected a justification, more of that blunt pragmatism. Not this. "I should have asked you," he said. "I told myself it was faster and safer to act without telling you. That's true, but it is not the whole reason." He looked at the window, the pine-covered slope beyond it, the grey water of the creek catching the late afternoon light. "I didn't ask you, because I was afraid of your answer." Leora set the document down on the table. "Tell me what answer you were afraid of," she said quietly. He turned back to her. There was something in his face she had not seen before. Not quite vulnerability, but the thing that sits below stoicism when stoicism finally costs too much to maintain. "That you would take your money and go," he said. "That you would go back to Ontario, or go to Vancouver, or go anywhere that wasn't here, and I would be left in this valley with a balanced ledger and nothing else." He crossed the room. He stopped 2 feet from her. "I built this place out of 12 years of hard work, and I was proud of it, and I was entirely alone in it, and I had convinced myself that was the correct arrangement. And then you walked into this cabin in October and argued with me about the coffee ratio, and found the fraud in my accounts in 4 days, and didn't flinch when the storm locked us in for 9 days, and I stopped being able to convince myself." Leora looked at him for a long moment. "You are," she said slowly, without any question, "the most arrogant man I have ever met." "Yes," he agreed. "This document," she said, picking it up, "is an act of spectacular presumption." "Yes." "And you have approximately 30 seconds to give me a reason why I should not walk out that door." He reached out, carefully, with the deliberate restraint of a man who is aware of his own size, and took her hand in both of his. His palms were calloused, ink-stained on the right index finger from reviewing her ledgers at night. "Because you are not a schoolteacher from Ontario standing in someone else's mud anymore," he said. "You are the woman who runs this camp. You know every number in those books. You have built something real in this valley, and it belongs to you as much as to me. And if you walk out that door, I will follow you to the Kamloops station and ask you every single day on that platform until you tell me to stop." The wind moved through the pines outside. The creek ran high with the melt. Leora looked at their hands. "I want a proper partnership agreement," she said, "formally documented. Equal signing authority, not just a marriage record." "Done," he said. He did not hesitate. "And I will continue keeping the ledgers," she said, "because you are genuinely terrible with figures." "I know." She rose onto her toes and kissed him, and it was nothing like the careful, provisional things she had imagined during those long evenings by the fire. It was direct and certain and warm, like a column of figures that finally adds up correctly after many hours of stubborn work. Outside, the first pale green was beginning to show on the south-facing slopes, and somewhere below them the saw came back to life. A high, bright sound that meant the season was beginning, and the work was real, and all of it, every board foot and every balanced account and every hard-won acre, was theirs. Nobody had wanted her in Harrow Creek. They had been wrong about nearly everything.